This is the story of how 24 million people occupy 77% of Russia's territory, and why that number keeps shrinking. Siberia and the Russian Far East combined cover 13.1 million square kilometers, with a population density of just 1.1 people per square kilometer in the Far East, which makes it less dense than the Sahara Desert. And here's what most people get wrong about this place. Alaska is just as frozen. Northern Scandinavia faces similar temperatures, and northern Canada deals with comparable isolation. Yet these regions maintain stable or even growing populations, while eastern Russia has lost 22% of its people since 1991. The exodus continues today, driven not by climate, but by a century of policy decisions that treated this vast region as an extraction zone rather than a homeland, combined with the sudden collapse of the artificial mechanisms that made Soviet-era settlement possible in the first place. The numbers reveal just how empty we're talking about. Eastern Russia encompasses 2 federal districts, with the Siberian Federal District holding 16.5 million people spread across territory at a density of 3.8 people per square kilometer, while the Far Eastern Federal District manages even more extreme isolation at 7.9 million people and 1.1 per square kilometer. These 2 regions combined stretch larger than the United States, but hold fewer people than Texas. The Sakha Republic, also called Yakutia, is the world's largest subnational division at 3.08 million square kilometers and holds exactly 1 million people. That works out to 0.31 persons per square kilometer, while Chukotka Autonomous Okrug drops below 0.1 people per square kilometer. Primorsky Krai near the Chinese border achieves nearly 12 people per square kilometer, proving that even within eastern Russia, location matters enormously. Yakutsk stands as the world's coldest major city with 355,000 people, while Vladivostok and Khabarovsk anchor the Far East with roughly 600,000 each. These aren't growing boomtowns, though. They're survivors of a much larger demographic collapse that's still happening. The population you see today isn't stable. It's the remnant of a mass exodus that began the moment the Soviet Union fell. 1989 marked the peak when the Far Eastern Federal District reached 10.4 million people, and since then, 2.26 million have left, creating that 22% decline that defines the region today. Some regions collapsed even faster than others. Between 1991 and 1997, just 6 years, Magadan Oblast lost 36% of its population, while Chukotka hemorrhaged over 60% by the 2000s. The Siberian Federal District dropped from 21.1 million in 1991 down to 16.5 million today, and across eastern Russia, 19,500 villages now stand completely abandoned, which represents 13% of all rural settlements. Migration patterns tell the clearest story. The Far Eastern Federal District saw positive migration until 1990. Then the bottom fell out when 116,000 people fled in 1994 alone. This wasn't a gradual trend where people slowly drifted away. This was people arranging transport and fleeing as fast as they physically could. Which brings us to the real question. Why did they ever live there in the first place? And what changed so dramatically that millions decided to leave? Soviet-era settlement occurred through 3 mechanisms, all of which disappeared simultaneously when the USSR collapsed in 1991. And understanding this explains everything about the current emptiness. Forced labor came first. Over 30,000 Gulag camps housed an estimated 18 million prisoners over the system's existence, with major camp complexes literally building entire cities from nothing. Sevastlag held 200,000 prisoners, Bamlag had 201,000, and Dalag contained 113,000, all working to construct the infrastructure of settlement in places no one would voluntarily go. Magadan exists today as a city of 90,000 because prisoners constructed it entirely in the 1930s, while Norilsk, the largest polar city with 179,000 people, was built by Gulag labor mining nickel and copper. The Baikal-Amur mainline railway began as a Gulag project, which means these weren't just labor camps producing goods. They were state-sponsored colonization through imprisonment. Ethnic deportations provided the second wave. Approximately 3.5 million people were forcibly transferred to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Central Asia between 1930 and 1952, including 800,000 to 1.2 million Volga Germans deported in 1941. 490,000 Chechens and Ingush moved in a single night during February 1944. 171,000 Koreans expelled from the Far East in 1937, and 200,000 Crimean Tatars deported between 1943 and 1944. Soviet archives document 390,000 deaths during Kulak resettlement alone, and these weren't people choosing a new life. They were people forced to stay or die. The third mechanism involved generous incentives for voluntary workers who moved to extreme north territories. Wage premiums of 50 to 100% or more came with priority housing allocation, extra vacation time, early retirement, access to scarce consumer goods, and guaranteed employment, which meant these northern coefficients made economically irrational locations attractive by compensating for hardship through material benefits unavailable elsewhere in the shortage economy. And that's when everything changed. The Gulag system terminated in 1960. Deportees were gradually allowed to leave after 1957 for most ethnic groups, and only after 1991 for some. And post-Soviet economic collapse eliminated northern wage premiums entirely. Workers sometimes went 10 or more months without receiving any wages at all during the 1990s crisis, while freedom of movement, previously restricted by the Soviet internal passport system, suddenly allowed departure without punishment. Remove the stick forcing people to stay, and the carrot making it worthwhile, and what happens? Mass exodus, which is exactly what the numbers show. Even if you wanted to stay, even if you had a job that actually paid, the physical challenge of living in Eastern Russia extends far beyond temperature into basic survival logistics that most developed nations solved generations ago. Roads barely exist across most of the territory. The Trans-Siberian Highway, a continuous paved road from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, was completed only in 2015, which came more than a century after the railway, while Yakutsk, a regional capital of 350,000 people, had no direct road or rail bridge for years because the Lena River isolated it completely from the Trans-Siberian network. 42,000 bridges serve 2.8 million rivers across Russia, and that number has increased by just 200 since 2000. Khabarovsk region runs on 60% wooden bridges that warp seasonally, making what should be permanent crossings into temporary gambles with timing and weather. Seasonal isolation defines normal life for millions. Yakutia alone requires 9,000 kilometers of Zimnik winter roads laid annually, operational only 5 to 6 months when the ground freezes solid, while the Arktika Zimnik runs 1,600 kilometers from the Kolyma Highway to Chukotka's border as the only land route to drive there. Vehicles cannot cross major rivers between seasons, which leaves hovercraft transporting people while cargo waits weeks, and dozens die annually when vehicles fall through ice on roads with no gas stations for 600-kilometer stretches and temperatures reaching minus 62 degrees Celsius. Entire regions lack ground transportation entirely, which sounds impossible for modern society, but describes current reality. Kamchatka Peninsula has no ground transportation links to mainland Russia, leaving residents dependent entirely on air travel, while Sakhalin Island, with 490,000 people, has no bridge or tunnel to the mainland. Stalin began a tunnel project, but abandoned it after his death in 1953, and a new bridge is planned by 2035 at a cost of $252.8 billion Rubles, roughly $3.9 billion. Though severe ice conditions, including ice 1.5 to 2 meters thick with ice fields up to 25 kilometers long, make construction extraordinarily challenging. The railways that do exist can't handle current demand. 30% of eastbound freight demand went unmet in 2023 due to insufficient throughput, despite the Trans-Siberian and BAM railways, which forced Russia to commit 3.74 trillion rubles, about $38 billion, through 2032 to expand capacity to 270 million tons annually. That investment acknowledges decades of underinvestment, but serves freight movement rather than population settlement. Eastern Russia's business model extracts natural resources while minimizing permanent settlement, and this isn't an accident of geography. It's a deliberate choice, reflecting how Moscow views the entire region. Fly-in, fly-out rotational work has replaced traditional settlement patterns. 46% of workers at Yamal LNG are on rotational shifts, typically 14 days on and 14 days off, commuting from 100 to 5,000 kilometers away because companies prefer this model specifically to minimize costs. Building permanent housing, schools, hospitals, and services costs money, while flying workers in and out avoids those investments entirely. The pattern has largely replaced the company town model in resource production zones globally, but Russia's version occurs without the local benefit sharing that makes it tolerable elsewhere. Which brings us to the fundamental issue. Resource profits flow to Moscow under a constitution that places subsoil ownership with the federal government, leaving regional governors with limited autonomy, often funded in piecemeal ways and carrying significant debt to Moscow. Analysis describes Moscow's approach as viewing the Far East as a convenient money-making opportunity that can be exploited to further their own financial ends. Some exceptions prove the rule rather than breaking it. Alrosa, the world's largest diamond producer, contributed 939 billion rubles, about $22 billion, to Yakutia's economy between 2010 and 2020, including 408 billion rubles in taxes and 94 billion in dividends that represent roughly 1/3 of Yakutia's budget revenues. Sakhalin oil projects have delivered $16 billion in state revenue and $6.6 billion to the regional budget. But these stand as rare examples in a sea of extraction without compensation. Real personal incomes in Asian Russia not only fail to compensate for unfavorable living conditions, but run significantly lower than in the European part of the country, creating an obstacle to development that actively contributes to depopulation. Chukotka and Kamchatka carry Russia's highest cost of living indices, while Russia's real income runs permanently about 10% lower than European Russia, despite supposedly higher nominal wages. Working in one of the world's harshest environments, surrounded by enormous resource wealth, while earning less in real terms than someone in Moscow, creates the economic reality driving the exodus. Climate isn't the explanation, because if cold and remoteness made settlement impossible, Alaska shouldn't exist as a functioning society with growing communities and economic opportunities. Both regions feature extreme cold, both stretch across vast distances, and both run on resource-based economies. Yet their populations diverged because of governance rather than temperature. Alaska's Permanent Fund Dividend creates personal stakes in resource wealth through a system established in 1976 that pays annual dividends to all residents, which reached $1,702 per person in 2024. $734,000 in 1977 has grown to approximately $64 billion today, with over 90% of Alaskans receiving payments that create a strong political constituency, protecting the fund and keeping residents in state. This wealth-sharing model helps Alaska achieve the highest economic equality of any U.S. state. Russia has no equivalent because resource revenues centralize in Moscow without distribution to the regions producing the wealth. Federal investment anchors settlement in ways Russia has never attempted. $4.7 billion from the U.S. Department of Defense flowed to Alaska in fiscal year 2023 alone, while during the 1950s, uniformed military represented 23% of Alaska's population. Including dependents and civilian employees, approximately 40% of the population carried military connections, with the federal government once responsible for 80% of Alaska's basic employment, which represents sustained commitment rather than boom and bust project cycles. Northern Scandinavia shows similar patterns through different mechanisms. Norwegian Arctic regions have actually grown since 1990, with Troms County increasing by 15.7%, helped by the Gulf Stream moderating climate, but equally supported by robust healthcare, education, and services. Regardless of remoteness, regional development funds, youth retention programs, and strong Sami indigenous rights, including parliamentary representation since 1989. Nunavut's creation in 1999 fulfilled Inuit land claim agreements in northern Canada, establishing genuine indigenous self-governance over territory larger than Alaska, where federal transfers provide 72 to 82% of territorial budgets through consistent, predictable support rather than project-based patronage. Population remains small at around 130,000 across 3 territories, but stability matters more than size. These examples prove cold isn't the problem. Policy is. Russia has tried various initiatives, though results remain mixed at best, revealing a gap between announced programs and actual implementation that defines much of post-Soviet governance. The Far Eastern Hectare program launched in 2016, offering 1 hectare, 2.5 acres of free land to Russian citizens. And the statistics sound impressive at first glance. 157,000 applications came in, 121,000 recipients got land, and 81,100 hectares were distributed. But only 23,000 participants have completed the 5-year process to formalize property rights. Rejection rates ranging from 18 to 56% across regions reveal that economic incentives of municipalities contradict the goals of the program, while much of the distributed land lacks infrastructure, and the associated relocation employment program attracted only 1,100 citizens in 3 years due to complexity of mechanism. Special economic zones offer substantial tax breaks through programs like the Freeport of Vladivostok, established in 2015 with 5% income tax versus the standard 20% for 5 years, 0% customs duties in free zones, and 7.6% Social Security contributions versus 30%. Over 23 advanced special economic zones operate in the Far East, generating $113 billion in total foreign investment in the Far Eastern Federal District. But investment concentrates in energy sectors, and 5 years after launch, it became evident that the intention was not to transform Vladivostok into a free trade zone. Railway modernization represents the most serious commitment. Investment totaling over 5 trillion rubles through 2032 comes in 3 stages, with BAM capacity tripling to 42 million tons and a target of 270 million tons annually by 2032 that would represent transformative change. But here's the thing, it serves freight movement rather than population settlement, which means the investment helps extract resources more efficiently without creating reasons for people to actually live there. Climate change creates both threats and opportunities across the region, though the threats currently outweigh any potential benefits by a substantial margin. 60% of Russia's territory sits on permafrost that has warmed 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius over 30 years, with the Russian north warming 3 times faster than the rest of the country. Pipelines fail from ground shifting, foundations lose bearing capacity, and ice roads become unreliable as rivers no longer freeze thick enough, which threatens Norilsk with 178,000 people, Yakutsk and Vorkuta with 58,000, all built entirely on permafrost, now becoming unstable. Scientists warn of irreversible tipping points within 50 years. The northern sea route offers theoretical benefits through distance reduction. Murmansk to Yokohama runs 5770 nautical miles versus 12,840 via Suez, which represents a 30 to 40% distance reduction. And 2020 saw record traffic after ice-free periods lengthened. Russia is expanding its nuclear icebreaker fleet and signed a June 2024 agreement with China for year-round Arctic shipping, but high insurance premiums, lack of intermediate ports, and continued seasonal limitations mean the northern sea route remains marginal to global shipping. Atlantification of the Arctic, where warming waters reduce ice, may eventually eliminate Russia's icebreaker advantage entirely, turning what looks like an opportunity into another form of competitive disadvantage. Current trends offer no reversal of the demographic collapse that has defined Eastern Russia since 1991. 596,200 people disappeared from Russia's natural population in 2024, up 20.4% from 2023. While the country experienced its largest peacetime population, drop in recorded history during 2020 through 2021, with a natural decline of 997,000 between October 2020 and September 2021. COVID-19, combined with the Ukraine war's casualties and immigration, along with persistently low birth rates, accelerates the structural Far East decline that was already happening. Rosstat projects Russia's working-age population will shrink by approximately 13 million by 2040, which represents 15% of the labor force, while total population could fall to 130 million by 2046. UN projections suggest 120 million in 50 years, a 17% decline. The Far East loses 1.5 to 3% of rural population annually, and depopulation will likely accelerate as services contract further in a self-reinforcing cycle where fewer people means fewer services, which drives even more people to leave. Eastern Russia's sparse population reflects century-long decisions to treat the region as an extraction zone rather than a homeland, where Soviet-era settlement required coercion and compensation that no longer exist, and post-Soviet policies have failed to create sustainable alternatives. Alaska maintains a stable population through wealth sharing, federal investment, and genuine local governance, despite comparable cold and remoteness, proving the climate is challenging but not determinative. Russia's current approach, tax zones for energy companies, railway upgrades for freight, and modest land giveaways, addresses symptoms rather than causes because it leaves untouched. How resource wealth is distributed, how infrastructure serves residents instead of just extraction, and how governance empowers local communities. The region's future likely holds fewer people with larger industrial operations, creating a landscape of rotational workers and automated systems rather than sustainable communities that could build lives and raise families. 22% population loss since 1991 continues today with no reversal in sight. And when you lose over 2 million people from a region in 3 decades with every trend pointing toward further decline, you're witnessing not a natural phenomenon, but a policy failure of historic proportions. The emptiness is deliberate. Until the fundamental extraction model changes, that emptiness will only grow.